When my magic iPhone hits 3:02, we're going to begin the show. If you've ever been to the theater, this is when the lights are flashing in the lobby.
That's right. Telling everyone to get your wine and
you better get your seat because we're about to start. All right. Mary Catherine, I'm going to kick us off.
Great. Let's do it.
All right. Welcome, everybody. I'm Ann Mello, Associate Director at NAES, the National Association of Episcopal Schools. Really thrilled to join today with SAES, the Southwestern Association of Episcopal Schools, with David Madison, Executive Director here, and MK Duffy with us. I'm just going to do some very brief housekeeping and introductions. And we will get going. So we are going to have all of the lines muted during this presentation. It is being recorded and you will have access to the recording afterwards, so no need to take extensive notes. There will be 2 question and answer periods, one in the middle of our presentation and one at the end, and you're welcome to use the Q&A tool, which you'll see on your screen. I think that's all I have to say, MK, if you want to move us into the agenda.
Great, great. Well, everyone, we're glad you're here. This is such an important topic, and it's something that David and I, we talk regularly with, at least with our schools, about the importance of the church-school relationship. And the question of whose school is it anyway is often a question that's asked in many churches and schools, I suspect. And so today what we're going to be doing is exploring a couple of relationships that we believe are the most important relationships that determine how a church-school relationship looks. And that is the board and the vestry and the rector and the head. And those 2 relationships really set the tone for how everyone else behaves in the community. And so I'm going to throw it over to Ann, and she's going to talk a little bit about some best practices.
Yeah, so the starting place is when we are leaders of a parish with a school or a school with a parish. It's important to just begin with some baseline common understanding of the nature of a church-school relationship. And this information comes from our NAES Principles of Good Practice for Governance in Parish Day Schools. So it doesn't matter whether you're a member of the board or the vestry, the rector, or the head. These provide some really good foundational concepts for a strong relationship. The first is it's really important for the church to view the school as an outreach of the parish. As we know, schools are very different organizations than parishes. They function in different ways, and most of our schools and parishes have 2 very different sets of constituents. About 10 to 25% of our school families tend to be Episcopalians or in the parish. That may be greater in your church-school relationship or less, but that doesn't matter. The reality is there's a missional connection. The school was founded by the church, and the school embodies in some way, differently than a congregation, but aligned with the mission and meaning of what it means to be an Episcopal institution. So that fundamental belief that we are bound together in a common mission, although we touch different constituencies. The second thing is that unlike a traditional independent school board or a standalone vestry, the school board membership needs to have cross-representation. That is, it's very important that there be an appropriate representation or presence on the school board from the parish, the immediate parish with whom it has a relationship. And in some schools, this may even be from the broader diocese, but you want to make sure that that allows not only for a communication relationship, but it brings those perspectives that parishioners and vestry members can bring. In the view of NAES, this should always include the rector. It should use and always include some vestry members, Sometimes those are a warden or more than one warden, although you have to watch out for how busy wardens are. Sometimes it is simply vestry representation. And typically there are a number of parishioners on the board. If you're lucky, you have parishioners whose children went to the school, or you might have parishioners who are educators who bring some other professional expertise as well. But it's really important to constantly be thinking, do we have the right people around the table? And do we have the right cross representation from the church onto the school's board? Now, here's the thing. If you look technically at the org chart, from as far as chancellors of dioceses are concerned, if you're one corporation, as many are in my part of the world, it looks very hierarchical. And if you look at the org chart, if you're two corporations, it might look like you don't really have to have anything to do with one another. But the reality is that this collegial partnership between the church and the school, whether it's technically, legally, hierarchical, or technically, legally separate, it has to function in practice as a team. We encourage our heads and rectors to think of each other as leader partners who get to know each other's ministries, who are transparent with each other, and who help each other's communities to understand their collective role. And the same is true of volunteers, whether those are board members or vestry members, etc. And this is the most distinctive, quote unquote, additional job of a rector and a head of school and a board and a vestry in these kinds of organizations. But it tends not to work really great when people either rely on hierarchy to force decision-making, or the bylaws, or legalistic kind of relationships. We really want it to be collegial. And the last thing is that the school being an Episcopal school, our parish schools being Episcopal schools, is not one person's job. It's not the chaplain's job or the rector's job, the head's job, etc. It is everybody's job. And I couldn't urge boards and vestries more strongly to be sure that in their orientations, in their ongoing education, and in their communication, there's always a return to what is the Episcopal identity of the school, how is it expressed, and how do each of us in our role take ownership for supporting it, holding up, being an advocate for it, and at times having to reinterpret or maybe even reimagine it. But again, it's everybody's job. So if people don't know what that is, if we've never had conversations about it at all the 360-degree dimensions of the church-school relationship, it's bound to be like Three Blind Men and the Elephant, where everyone has their own idea of what it is. And so I will leave that there, but as you're listening to this webinar, I would urge you to think to yourself, how does this play out in our church school relationship, in our head rector or board vestry relationship? Where do we have some strength, and where do we maybe have a gap or a lapse where we could maybe shore up some of these foundational understandings? So go ahead, MK, onward ho.
So I want to build on what Anne mentioned with regard to a collegial relationship between all the different players in parish day school governance. One of the things that Brene Brown talks about is clear is kind, unclear is unkind. And so I think it makes sense for us to spend a little bit of time looking at the different players in this day school governance world and trying to figure out what does it look like from a clear perspective as to where the direct connections are. So let's take a look at this. So at the start, at the very highest level, I mean, I guess we could go higher. I guess we could talk about TEC or the Anglican Communion. We could really go high if we wanted to, but let's start with the diocese. And the diocese is obviously led by the bishop, and many dioceses have a school commission. Not every diocese, but if your diocese has a school commission, then be aware of that, because that's going to be a great connection between the school and the diocese. But underneath the diocese, we have parishes, and the vestry calls the rector of the parish. And then the parish says, you know, school work is complicated. What we'd like to do is create a school board and delegate the functional autonomy to govern the school to the school board. So the vestry empowers the board to be the governing body. And then in turn, the board hires the head of school. The board has one employee, the head. That's it. And then in turn, the head of school then hires all the other employees that work at the school. So this is a fun tool to use because you see where the direct connections are, and that's helpful. I think it's equally helpful to identify where the direct connections don't exist. What do I mean by that? For example, there's not a direct connection between parish and head of school. Why is that? Well, the head of school generally is not an employee of the rector or an employee of the parish. In this model, the head of school is employed by the board. So that presents some challenges if the parish or the rector is tasking the head of school or giving the head of school certain expectations for her or him to fulfill. You also don't see a direct connection between school board and all employees. Why is that? Well, the employees of the school don't work for the board. The employees of the school work for the head. This can be a little bit of a challenge if that's not clearly understood by everyone. And also, if the board allows themselves to be an end around if employees are unhappy with what's going on from the decision making of the head. So that would be inappropriate, for example, for the board to force a direct connection between itself and all employees. Why is that? Because the employees work for the head of school. So I think it's really important as leaders of a parish day school to understand this governance structure, understand where the connections are, understand where the connections are not, so that if you see maybe someone trying to force one of those connections, you know what to do. One more comment before we move on. In the midst of COVID, one of the trends is definitely that there is more interaction from the higher levels of the pyramid this year than you may experience in other years. Now that's no reason to panic, but that can cause some anxiety. For example, the diocese may be a little more involved in asking questions about the day-to-day operation of the school than you would normally experience. So what I'm advising all of our schools is just maybe this year be a little more proactive and make sure that communication is intentionally flowing up a little bit more than you may in the past. So for example, when we reopened this year, lots of our dioceses and the SAES family wanted to see schools reopening plans. In a normal year, that would be unusual. But because we're in a situation where so many of those day-to-day conversations now carry with them health and safety concerns, that you may have a little more interaction than normal from some of the higher levels. Nothing to panic about, but just be intentional and ask the question of whether or not I can address that by sending a little more information higher up than we normally do. So another way to take a look at this is parish and school have the same shared mission, but they have different perspectives or different expressions. Let's take a look at that, because that sometimes gets lost. Ann and I, and MK and I spend a whole lot of time trying to make sure that parishes and schools get along. And so one of the things I have a little joke that I normally throw out about, I'm not married, but I understand the secret to marriage is making sure that the person you marry, you force them to be as close and as similar to you as possible. That's the secret to success, right? Well, no, that's going to be a disaster if your goal is to marry someone and then turn them into you. Rather, it makes a lot of sense to recognize we've got different expressions here. We've got different ways of being. Let's not spend energy on trying to force the other to be more like us. Rather, let's spend our energy on trying to understand the other and how do we all row in the same direction with the shared mission. So let's take a look at what I mean by those different expressions. So for example, in a parish on any given Sunday, 100% of the folks there are either Episcopalian or wanting to learn how to be Episcopalian. And as Anne mentioned with the percentages, it's very different in the school. The national average hovers somewhere in that 15% number. Some schools may be a little higher, a little lower, but the takeaway is that the vast majority of the families in Episcopal schools are not Episcopalian. That's very, very different from what you see in a parish. That's not something to try to quote fix unquote necessarily. That's great. We create diverse, we create diverse communities, and we want to create diverse communities, but that's going to be an example of different expressions, different language, and that's okay. The parish is really based on volunteers. The school has lots of contracts, lots of enrollment contracts, lots of contracts with different service providers, contracts with faculty. That shapes how you interact with the different stakeholders. A pledge card is different from an enrollment contract. And just what does that mean? What does that mean and how we're going to interact with our stakeholders? Obviously, the parish is subject to church authorities. The school is subject to church authority as well. However, the school also has these humorless accreditors like SAES that have expectations and standards and reports that we require and check-ins. And so in addition to church authority, schools have to handle all of that with accreditation. Depending on the age of kiddos that you're working with, schools also have to deal with state licensing. And if you think accrediting is humorless, state licensing can also be humorless as well. There's very little gray area in lots of state expectations, particularly if you're working with 2-year-olds, 3-year-olds, 4-year-olds. That's very different from the church that has a little more flexibility. So things like, well, just put that box there, just move that around. We can store that in that classroom. That can really be a problem if there are state expectations or licensing expectations about how the space is used. Sometimes a church may not fully understand that. Pledges and tuition, a little bit different as well. Pledges, voluntary. We hope that pledge card is going to be honored. Some years it is, some years it's not. Very different from an enrollment contract and how you handle a legal liability or a legal expectation to receive tuitions, especially when the school has already spent those tuition dollars in the contract they've signed with their faculty. So it's a very different understanding as opposed to just someone not fulfilling a pledge, if that makes sense. The fiscal year is important because think about cash flow in your personal life. If cash becomes tight at any given time throughout the year, things can get a little bit anxious. Well, if you look at the cash flow, a January to December fiscal year has different high points and low points compared to a July fiscal year. Churches are set by canon to be a January to December fiscal year. You have no flexibility whatsoever with that. Schools, if you're really following activity-based accounting, that doesn't make sense to do a January to December fiscal year. It makes sense for us to have a fiscal year that matches the program, which really is a July or an August start. So as you're having those conversations about shared use or shared expenses, depending on, you want to be intentional about when you schedule those conversations, because if one organization at that particular time is doing really, really well from a cash flow perspective, and one organization is really, really struggling from a cash flow perspective, obviously that's going to shape the conversation. So be cognizant of that and be intentional about when you have that conversation. And then finally, just the question of lots of volunteers on the parish side versus lots of staff on the school side. Again, it all goes to how the organization interacts with its stakeholders. But at the core, same mission. Church and school are trying to accomplish the same thing, but we need to be very intentional about them accomplishing it in a different way and having a little grace, being able to inject some grace into the situation and not trying to force the other to be more like us.
Okay, so we're ready for some questions and answers, Anne.
Yeah, so you can put into the chat tool any questions you have thus far about anything that David has said or that I have said that's been brought to your mind. I'm going to start while I'm waiting for a question to come in on the chat. I would like to say something about single corporation schools, because A lot of schools in SAES membership are in fact separate corporations, some form of a separate corporation. Many schools in other parts of the Diocese of the Episcopal Church are very often a single corporation. And everything David has said applies equally in both cases. I was head of a single corporation, pre-K to 8th grade school. We had delegated governance from the vestry. We had separate finances, including, segregated bank accounts. We ran on a academic fiscal year, and I signed my contract with the board. The rector was part of the executive committee, and so the rector and the board chair signed my contract, but only the board could continue my employment, terminate my employment, and call a new or hire a new head of school. And of course, with the rector's involvement in that, and ultimately the vestry's seal of approval. But everything David has said is true whether you're one corporation or two. So here's a question for here. Two questions. I'm going to push this one to you first, David. What do you suggest as initial positive steps for a rector to relate to the school community? Let's say you're a brand new rector,
Yep.
You're new. What guidance would you offer, David?
Great question. And I get that question a lot as well. Like you said, Anne, from a new rector or a rector that wants to improve how they relate to the school. So I go back to the core of everything a solid rector does is pastoral care. So elements of ministry of presence is where you begin to develop those relationships, and then making sure that you view the school community as an equal part of your flock, for a lack of a better way to describe it. So that means building the relationships. You can't build the relationships when you're not physically present. And I know that takes time. And I know that rectors are spread thin, like so many different leaders are spread thin, but I encourage them to be intentional about being around, depending on the setup, depending on if there's a chaplain or not. Perhaps the rector can participate in some of the school worship as well, but really trying to be around. And then gold standard pastoral care. So things like how does the rector know if a school family has a hospitalization, or if there's been a death in the family, or if there are things that that could require or indicate a need for pastoral care. So to me, I think that's critically important. I think at the core, this is all relationships. And if a rector really wants to create some positive steps to relate to the school community, first and foremost, you make sure they can get to know you. And you do that by being around, by demonstrating how much you love the fact that they're part of the community. And you have to be intentional about that.
And then I would just add to that, learn as much as you can about the story of the church and the school. And find out what is the nature of the relationship. Where have there been bumps along the way? Where have there been crises? And learn as much as you can about the nature of school governance. Probably your school, if you go above a preschool, you're part of an accrediting agency, and there'll be professional development opportunities. So, and the last thing is, try to make the school and the school board meetings a priority. It's really tough. Rectors are so busy, but it's really hard if the bylaws say the rector's a voting member of the board and the rector doesn't come to meetings or can't make meetings or doesn't get to that executive committee meeting or whatever it might be. So take the time to have that one-to-one regular time with the head of school and to be engaged in board work. That way, the relationship will just get off to a good start.
I think it's a great idea. And I want to add one more thing. If you are relatively new to ministry as well, just recognize that the way that schools function, the different ways that school express themselves, sometimes seminary training does a good job of explaining that. Sometimes seminary training does not. And so just be aware that what you have learned in seminary about parish governance doesn't exactly translate 100% to the school piece as well. So I would throw that out.
Hey, Anne, one thing I would, just from the head of school's perspective, that I would also just say with regard to that relationship is that I know that, again, we all know that it's difficult for rectors because they have to do vestry and school board, and that can be obviously just added time, but I think it sends a very important message to the head of school and the leadership of the school when the rector is consistently at those board meetings. And I think it also sends the opposite message when they're not, because it sends the message that you don't value the school, and that is a death blow, in my opinion, to the school church relationship. So I want to reiterate what David said just about that relationship building and what the rector can do to begin that process, I think is critical.
And we have a wonderful school head here, Episcopal Parish School Head, experienced, who reminds us in the chat that it's very important for rectors not to become triangulated between the church and the school, to really understand the roles and authority, and so that people don't do an end run around the board or the head to the rector. And so that's something to clarify right up front, especially if you're not familiar with school governance, or you're not familiar with sort of how does a vestry and a board and a head and a rector negotiate the boundaries of authority. Say a parent is unhappy, can they go to the rector? A parishioner is unhappy with the school, can they go to the rector? My answer would be they can go, but the rector should refer them back to the school. There's another question here which says, with less identity between church and school, it's nearly impossible to find parishioners who will serve on the school board. Any ideas? So what happens when perhaps the church and the school are ships that pass in the night? The bylaws say you have to have a certain number of parishioners on the board, but gosh darn it, you're finding it hard to find people to do it, be willing to do it, and come to meetings and roll up their sleeves. What do you think about that, MK? You've been a school head.
Well, yeah, I think that the challenge is sometimes what the size of your parish is too. I mean, if you can even get people, but part of what I think you can do as a school head, the relationship, and we're going to talk about this later in the webinar, but the more active as a school head that you are in the church, the more presence. We talked about presence with the rector in the school, but the presence of the head of school in the church is also important, because the more they see you, the more they're going to go, oh, we have a school. Oh yeah, I could be a part of that. The more relationship I'm building as the head of school with the parishioners, the more likely that we can get people to want to be a part of that. So I think that the same is true for building relationship between the head of school and the parish. And that's easy. That was easy for me as a head of school, because I'm an Episcopalian and I went to church now there's the downside sometimes of being a member of the church and being the head of school, but the upside is that I knew everyone in the church as well. And so it was easier for me to say, hey, I'd really like you to be a part of the school, and people would trust that. So I think it always starts with a relationship.
Yeah, and I would say as well that I would say about every 3 or 4 years, I would really urge boards in collaboration with their vestry or through their governance committee and the rector, the executive committee, to take a look at that board composition. And if you're struggling to find any particular type of school board member to serve, to ask them questions. Have things changed? Is it just that the relationship is weak? Is it that the school has grown fourfold and the church has shrunk? Is it that we always relied on parent parishioners to fill those roles, and maybe everyone's kids have grown up and we're sort of at a point? So think about why that is, and don't be afraid to change the composition of your board if it's just not working anymore. And if your bylaws haven't been looked at, your board composition hasn't been looked at in 10, 15 years, but the church and the school have changed in 10 or 15 years, it might be a good moment just to give it a refresh.
Agreed.
Yep, I agree. Okay.
All right. Honored ho.
Let's go on and talk about the roles and responsibilities. We're going to get a little bit more tactical here. Roles and responsibilities of the church and the school. And before we go into specific roles and responsibilities, I just want to talk a little bit about some underlying principles that should be in place when you think about those roles and responsibilities. The first one I really have an affinity for, because I think it's critical that we have, especially as a school, that we understand and have a heartfelt appreciation for the rich tradition of Episcopal education, and that we acknowledge that we would not even be a school were it not for the vision of the supporting parish. And I came from a parish day school that was founded in 1948, and so the tradition, the rich heritage that I got when I became the head of school was incredible. And I think that builds relationship when the school acknowledges what the church did. It's a little bit like when you're a kid and, and you're 17, maybe you don't appreciate your parents, but then when you get to be about, I hope maybe 28, you go, wow, you really did a lot for me. So I think it's really important and it builds relationship. The second is just the idea around the absolute assurance that the school boards are functionally independent, that vestries are giving that defined independence, but that school boards are also accountable to the parish for preserving that Episcopal identity. The vestry has that role. The vestry has a role in ensuring that Episcopal identity is a stronghold in the school. And so it's that kind of twofold. We want our school boards to be functionally independent, but we understand as a board that we're responsible to the parish to ensure that we're doing what we need to do from an Episcopal identity standpoint. And the final one is just an understanding that the rectors and the vestries do have an interest in that in their partner schools. And I would even say not just for Episcopal identity, but just for financial stewardship, making sure that the schools are doing what they need to be doing. And so if you base those relationships on those things, then it's easier to begin to kind of define your roles. And so we're going to talk about what the role of the church is and what the role of the school is. So let's look at the church. So the church's role, first and foremost, is to oversee the Episcopal identity, to make sure that that's in place, that we're having chapel, that we're having formation, that the tenets of Episcopal identity exist and are strong in our school. That the church empowers the board to operate and set policy for the school. The vestry doesn't do that. It empowers the school board to do that. That the church is continually working to maintain positive church-school relationships and communication. The head's making regular reports to the vestry. I would articulate that is also kind of what we just talked about, that the head of school is participating in the life of the church, and that we're continually building that relationship. One of these things that I really like is the assurance that annual vestry orientation includes an education around the nature of the relationship with the school. That's an area that I think sometimes doesn't exist, especially when you have a really good church-school relationship, and maybe you have a longtime head, and everybody kind of trusts everybody. Sometimes I think that can be an undercurrent that gets missed and can create problems, because churches are getting new people who may not know the history of the school and the church. And there may be, so just regularly training vestry and orienting vestry about what is the nature of our relationship with the school, and how are we as vestry members supposed to support the school? How do we, that, as we talked about earlier, the idea of what if you're a vestry member and a parishioner comes to you to complain about the school, is that your role? That kind of annual training is important. And then finally, we talked about this just a second ago, but insisting on financial transparency, ensuring that there's transparency between the school and the parish. And those are the roles of the church. So we'll let Ann talk about the school.
Yeah, and the school has its own responsibilities. It has, when the vestry delegates to the school board, not only the authority, but the responsibility for governing the school, for stewarding the school sustainably, stewarding its resources, and to make sure that the school is being responsibly, thoughtfully, and carefully operated, not only in terms of programs and finances, but in terms of and academics, but in terms of its Episcopal mission as an Episcopal school in relation to the parish and to its own history. So one of the most important roles of the board is the school's board is to support, evaluate, and terminate, if necessary, the head of school. If you are about to go embark upon a leadership transition, if your head of school or preschool director is about to retire or thinking of a move, this is one of the most important things that the board will do. And I urge you to work with SAES or NAES to talk through what a really good search process is. The match between this head of school and the school's mission, particularly its Episcopal identity, is critical. There are wonderful educators out there who can do amazing things, but if they don't want to be part of a church-related school in the Episcopal tradition and really embrace, embody, and steward that identity, it's probably not going to be a relationship that works. The second is that the board, the school board, is basically responsible for all of the normal functions of what we would call an independent school board. Even if you're one corporation, we believe at NAES, and I know SAES even more so, that our school boards should function to the greatest degree possible with the way a good, solid, independent school board would operate, in addition with all of the collaboration and crossover and missional alignment with the church. So it is the board's job not only to set the mission and strategic priorities of the school, but also to preserve the Episcopal identity. And one of the things that I see on Episcopal school boards from time to time is that, as MK says, as new people come on the vestry, but as new people come on the board, if they're not oriented well to the relationship with the church, the governing relationship, and the Episcopal mission of the school, they may come in with all good intentions, may make suggestions that may not be that helpful and can't fulfill their role as best they can as school board members. So like other nonprofit organizations and schools, the board should be thinking about who should be sitting around the table. Obviously, the vestry reps and the rector are chosen and come across from the church's governance body to the school, should have good expertise in fiduciary management and finances, and should really make sure that the head of school is empowered to operate the school. Now, there can be, because their rector is active on this board, I always like the rector to sit on the executive committee of the board where possible, and to sit on the committee on trustees or the nominating committee. So there's no surprises. But it is really important that the board, with the full involvement of its rector and parish and vestry trustees, school board members, executes these jobs, and that the vestry allows the school to do this. So it's a two-way street. The school takes seriously its responsibility to do this well, and the vestry asks the school board to do it well. Now, every once in a while, there are bumps along the way, and perhaps the vestry loses confidence in the board. And I have seen that one of the most well-meaning reactions is, we'll just take over the board. We'll just, that board doesn't seem to be doing things well, or we don't like some of the direction it's going. So what we'll do is we'll just have more direct governance of the school by the vestry. That very rarely, if ever, works. Rather than doing the work of the board for the board, the vestry should be helping the board to be the best board it can be, and to together figure out how the board can function better. But we really, really have found that micromanagement of the vestry to the board doesn't work, because schools are just too darn complicated, as MK said. But equally, again, it is very important that the school board step up to the plate and demonstrate to the vestry its ability to be fantastic stewards of finances, of physical plant, usually done in collaboration, and most important, of the Episcopal, particularly the Episcopal mission and expression of the school.
Okay, so one of the, probably in my opinion, the most important tactical thing that you can do to establish a good relationship is a shared use agreement. And it's often we run into parish day schools that don't even know that exists. And so I want to begin the discussion around shared use agreements, just understanding what the components might be. and this came from a shared use agreement that we did when we at my former school. And number one was the idea around a covenant that describes the relationship with the church and the school. And I don't know that we really necessarily began it from the perspective of, oh, let's write a covenant. I think we just, the rector and I were just thinking to ourselves, we should sit down and write down what makes this parish day school special, because we were concerned about that one of us or both of us might leave in the future and what would happen. And we really had a pretty good relationship, and we wanted to do that. What ended up happening is that our a former rector who was a bishop at the time helped us write, and he made it a covenant. And that's then why it became a covenant for our community. But that covenant really just described kind of what the expectations were around and it elevated that the church school relationship matters. It matters to the parish. It matters to the school community. And what does that really look like? And so we began our shared use agreement with that, rather than here is how we're going to do all the nuts and bolts of it. I also think that it makes it less business-like, and it makes it more Christ-like when we are entering into a covenant together to talk about how we're going to live our shared life. And so I love that I think that you can't go wrong by starting your shared use agreement with a covenant. After that, you want to begin to think about things around shared costs, utilities, insurance, maintenance, repairs, shared employees, things that you're working together on. And how are we going to do that? And what is, what's it going to, is it going to be 50-50? Is it going to be 30-70? Those are the kinds of things that you have to think about. And you want to be sure that you put in your shared use agreement that is specific. So while the covenant may be kind of a big picture, 30,000 feet up on what we look like as a partnership, the shared costs, number 2, 3, and 4 are really more tactical. Who are our shared employees and what are we going to pay? If it's repairs on this building, I'm in charge of it. If it's repairs on that building, you're in charge of it. If it's this building, we split it. So it's that kind of tactical, granular decision making. And you want to be specific. In my opinion, the better you're going to keep your relationship better if you're more specific.
Yeah, and I think that I wanted to emphasize the covenant nature of the relationship, because if you have a lot of lease, we don't like the word lease or rent, because that implies a contractual relationship, and it's not a quid pro quo. It's not a commercial transaction. It is a relational agreement. This shows all the things that should be taken into account. There's a lot of different ways to do it, such as property improvements and capital campaigns. Those can sometimes those are funded in different ways by different entities. It depends on how integrated or separate your facilities are. And often it also depends on the capacity of the school and the capacity of the parish. And you have to be realistic about that. But you should have a written document that you go through each of these 8 items and decide how it's going to work. This should be done jointly by the church and school together, usually with a small committee. Often it's great to have a couple of board members and a couple of vestry members, and they have to have people who are reasonable, sensible, have gravitas in the community, and can look out for, can do what is the right thing to do in a fair and equitable way. Probably review them every 3 or 4 years, unless something major has come up, like a major building is burned, or someone's, building something new, or there's a major financial crisis. This doesn't have to be in the bylaws, nor should it, because then you got to change the bylaws every time you want to change the agreement. This should be a separate memorandum of understanding or shared use agreement. And I know that both SAES and NAES work with individual schools to help them kind of noodle through that, because each person's setup and size and context is unique.
Yeah, and one other thing that I would say too, this is a what you don't want to do. What shouldn't happen is that the church writes the shared use agreement and hands it to the head of school, or vice versa. I've seen it I haven't seen it very often where the school did it, but I have seen where the church said, oh yeah, we have a shared use agreement. Here it is. We wrote it and we gave it to the school. And that's not collaborative. And it certainly does not build relationship when it's kind of like, I think what we talked about, what you just said about when a vestry goes in and decides I'm going to tell you how to run your board instead of helping you. And so it's got to be collaborative. Okay, we're going to turn it over to David now to talk about communication.
So one of the things I love to do is to give Mary Catherine grief about picture selection. So MK, just so we're on the same page here, is that a pug wearing a denim jacket?
Yes, it is. And I want you to note that the pug looks surprised, right?
Okay,
You don't want surprises, right? So I mean, this is what people look like when they're surprised.
And so you went with the eyes. You were trying to capture the pug.
The denim jacket was just a bonus. Okay.
You know what? Okay, that is very, very fair. So if you are interested in really, really hurting this relationship between vestry and board, or hurting the relationship between head and rector, inject a whole bunch of surprises. Just wait until things get interesting. I can't remember who said this, but no one likes surprises except on their birthday. And even on your birthday, I don't know if you like surprises. So gang, you need to have a process where even when the information isn't particularly fun to share, it gets shared. You got to look at it like water damage in a house or a leaking pipe. Not talking about it only makes it worse. And so one of the things, going back to the question about what can a new rector do, or a new head of school do when they're trying to get established, I think the very first thing is to subscribe to the covenant of no surprises, and just make sure that those leaders understand that, hey, I promise and I covenant with you that I'm not going to surprise you with good, bad, or indifferent news. And especially if it's challenging news, we're going to get behind closed doors and we're going to talk about it. That's one of the things that you can really do to keep this relationship healthy. Which leads to conflict management as well. You know, like I said, there's going to be disagreement. There's going to be conflict. It's a friction point. You know, we talk about friction points sometimes on where conflict can arise. And the friction points are always space, money, personalities.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes those can be potential areas for friction. There's going to be conflict, and making sure that we have a process for how do we handle that conflict in an appropriate way. One example, there needs to be an annual review of the shared use agreement so that we have a nonplussed way to have a conversation about, is this working? Have things shifted from one year to the next? You don't want, a worst practice would be the only time we talk about the shared use agreement is when there's a crisis or a problem. That's not the best conflict management approach. Making sure those lines of communication are open, and you can have those conversations. Another COVID theme that we're seeing, I'm advising boards currently to have a conversation about what's our philosophy and approach to conflict and unhappy stakeholders. This is a period of time where, just because of the decisions we're having to make, we're maybe dealing with a little more conflict and a few more unhappy stakeholders than we would normally, just because the reality of some of the things we're having to do. So be very intentional about how we handle conflict. And those two leaders have got to demonstrate that it's okay for us to conflict. We have a healthy way of handling that, because that models the kind of behavior you're going to see throughout the entire system. In the alternative, you will have poor conflict management modeled by the two leaders, and then that will be the behavior that gets picked up by other stakeholders as well.
Okay, so let's talk about the second relationship that we want to focus on. We focused on the vestry and the school board. Now let's focus on the rector and the head. And I have always said that in my view, the rector sets the tone for this as well. Right or wrong, good, bad, or indifferent, the rector sets the tone when it comes to how the school the relationship is going to be with that school head. And so, so there are a few things that the rector needs to remember about their role in the school. And David touched on this a little bit, the idea around engagement, regular visits in classrooms and on campus, cultivating relationships with faculty, cultivating relationships with parents, engaged member of the board and communities. The reality is that the more the rector is seen in the life of the school, the more trusted he or she is. When there is going to be a difficult thing, which there will be, it's much easier for the rector to kind of help facilitate that. So that engagement really is important. Representing the school in the larger community. You know, I'm not from a big city. I live in Harlingen, and it's a pretty small community, I guess, relatively speaking. But our rectors have always been a presence in the community as a church leader, and our rectors always knew that they are also representing the school in that community. And so it's really important. That may be different a little bit in a city, but there's always the community that the rector is representing, and the representation doesn't just stop with the church. It's the school as well. You know, the idea around the spiritual leader of the community, I think, is really important. The rector sets the spiritual tone, ensures that there is spiritual formation taking place. From a tactical perspective, you know, some schools will have chaplains. Some parish schools don't have chaplains. They have, in our diocese, the Diocese of West Texas, the majority of our schools have rectors and assistant rectors, and those people serve as the chaplain, right? And so in that case, our rector or an assistant rector would set the theme for chapel for the year. They would lead chapel pretty regularly. Again, if there was an issue related to a kid at the school, or we were praying for something, or we were doing that the rector was just in the middle of that. And then finally, the role of an important role is just the partner friend. We call it the work spouse of the head of school. And the reality is that in some parish communities, and this was true in mine, I spent a lot of time with my rector. We worked collaboratively. We were partners, and that really did kind of set the tone for the whole church school relationship, because we worked in that collaborative spirit.
Yeah, and I wanted to talk about the role of the head of school. So, for instance, I was not a parishioner at the church that was associated with my school, but I absolutely made a report at the annual parish meeting. I wrote in the monthly parish newsletter. I actually preached once a year. I ran a parent group about 5 or 6 times a year with parish parents after coffee hour, and went to the major events of the parish, such as the Saints' Day, the annual picnic, etc. It's really important that parishioners get to know the head and say, well, they seem like a reasonable person, or I had a nice cup of coffee, or I didn't realize Ann lived in Brooklyn, or whatever it might be. And so engaging in the life of the church. And I think as a head of school, it's important for the head of school and the rector to sit down together and really outline what that should look like, so we don't have different sets of expectations. And ditto the rector's involvement in the life of the school. Like if there's 6 events you'd really love the rector to be sure to come to, get them on the rector's calendar. And if there's 8 church events that the rector feels the head of school really needs to be present at, get on the head's calendar. Don't leave this to chance. When we say we represent the church to the school community, this is not only letting people know that your school is associated with this church, but also, I believe, it means advocating for the church even when people are unhappy. It's explaining why sometimes what is not visible to regular people in the school, the head of school has to advocate for. So I'll give you an example. We had a large gym that was used on the weekends for parish ministries that we thought were very important, a street youth program and a tutoring program. And parents would come to me and say, hey, Ann, we could make a lot of money if we had birthday parties in the gym on the weekends. And I would say, we can't do that. The church uses it for their ministry. And then they'd get all huffy, but it's our gym. I say, no, it's not our gym. these are important ministries of the church. We support those ministries and they take priority on the weekend. And so I know that other schools can rent their gym for birthday parties, but our school is committed to these outreach programs of the church. It was important that I said that. That the rector didn't say that I didn't say, yeah, I know that church over there keeps taking up all the space. So when we say we represent the church to the school community, we have to represent that we work in partnership with the church. And sometimes that means we have to give a little bit so the church can execute something, just as the church is going to give a little bit so we can execute something. So that when my rector tells the Easter egg hunt committee that they can't come in on a Tuesday at 11 o'clock to dye 1,000 Easter eggs because it's the middle of lower school lunch, the rector holds tight and is very upbeat about that and says, but sorry, have to do it when there's not lower school lunch. It's the spiritual objectives and then communicating regularly about what the needs are of the school. And I want to go back to the transparency that David talked about. It's very important that the head be transparent with the rector about what the school's needs are, short-term and long-term, and what the vision and plans are, and that you not hide anything from each other. The last thing I'll say is that this relationship management, the being present at church events, the communicating about the church, writing in the parish newsletter, whatever that might look like, takes extra time. And your colleagues from other schools that are not Episcopal parish schools are going to think you're crazy because they don't have a vestry or a parish or a rector. Just as the rector's colleagues are saying, well, how can you have that school and that board? It's extra time. So if you're the head of a parish related school, you will have a whole additional set of meetings, relationships, conversations to do. And that means decision making goes more slowly in certain areas. So if it needs the vestries, okay, or if it's going to engage the parish's property or needs, then you're going to have to build in more time to get those decisions made. And the head is often the only person who has visibility to that and has to work with their board and with their parish and vice versa. If the school needs something done right away, because that's what the law got changed to, it's the head who has to say to the church, we can't have 16 meetings about this, like the cockroaches need to be gone tomorrow or we lose our license.
Yeah. That's a great point. And we want to talk about just 4 best practices that we believe are ways to cultivate that relationship. So
we've hit 2 already really well. So I just want to highlight again what Ann said with regard to be intentional about the relationship between the head and the rector. Don't just assume that's going to happen, and it takes time. So do that, schedule those regular meetings. And then also, again, the covenant of no surprise is critically important.
Yeah. And then just the support and the engagement we've kind of talked a lot about, and we just cannot stress enough the collaborative nature of that. The last thing before we go to Q&A that I want to talk about is just some thoughts about how a rector, this is a little, when I did this the first time, a kind of a personal privilege, because I think it's really important for rectors to be reminded, and especially right now with COVID, being a head of school is brutal in terms of the decision making and how everything is. I was talking to a head of school earlier today who said what used to take 1 or 2 steps takes 6, and it's just a lot. And it's when we talk about rectors being pastoral to the community and being pastoral to the parents and the faculty, there's no better place for you to be pastoral than with your head of school. And that means a few things. Number 1, taking time to know the major day-to-day issues. Now, I am not talking, please do not hear me say that you as a rector need to spend hours listening to tedious details. No, it's not what I'm talking about. But just being aware, if you know that there's a pretty big an angry parent that's wearing a head of school out, or that there's something really hard that the head of schools is dealing with, to know about that stuff, to encourage that head of school to take his or her vacation days. Heads are not very good at that. And sometimes the rector is the person that can get them to do that the most. And so making sure that they're caring for themselves in a way that they need to care for themselves. I think we talked about this, the making sure that the head of school knows that you will not triangulate them. I had a rector who came to me on before the very first time I ever met him. He hadn't even started yet. And he said, I will never triangulate you. We are partners. You can trust me. And that just felt like heaven to know that I didn't have to fret or worry about that. And I think you can pray regularly for and with your head of school. And to remember what a lonely job it is, because it is a difficult job. It can be very lonely. And the relationship that the rector and the head can have and can share can be just a great friendship. I like this proverb, a sweet friendship refreshes the soul. It really matters. It matters to that head of school. So those are just some thoughts that I've had on how you can be a supportive rector. Okay, Ann, take it away.
Yeah, we're actually at the end of our technical time, but we're going to stay on for Q&A. I want to remind everyone that this is being recorded and will be shared with you at both the SAES and NAES websites. But if you have other questions that you'd like to ask at this time, just chat them in, pop them into the chat or the Q&A, and we'll be happy to answer them. I know we've thrown a lot at you in this time together, but we probably have time for maybe 1 or 2 questions if people would like to, especially if there's something that's burning in your heart or in your life at school and church that we can help with.
Nice job with the pug, NK.
That's a good pug. That's what people look like when they're surprised. Am I wrong?
That was a good call.
In fact, I've searched surprised, and that's what comes up. So, yeah, I thought so too. Although I'm not sure why
everyone's very quiet today. Micromanagement by vestry. Okay, here's a great topic. Micromanagement by the vestry. Should the vestry say, we want the school to improve diversity? Great question. On the one hand, the vestry does not directly manage the school. So the vestry should bring questions to the board. The vestry should bring questions to the board and have a conversation to the board, but ultimately it is the board's call. Right. Now, what you've raised here, however, I would say is also a missional question.
Episcopal identity too.
It's an Episcopal identity question. So in this way, it seems to me it would be important if this is an identity question that is important to the vestry, then the vestry and the board need to have some kind of a conversation about what that would look like, how it's mission centric, and how the school would or would not be able to set some goals and move towards that. It would not be very helpful for a vestry to give an ultimatum to the school saying, we want to see 30% more fill in the blank kids in the school, or we think your financial aid budget needs to be, $60 million. It is a fair, if it's missionally directed and identity directed, I think you have to have a dialogue about it.
I think that's exactly right. I think it crosses the line if it moves from, we think this is something that is part of our shared mission. I think it then crosses into something else if it becomes, and we want you to do A, B, and C now. That's where I think it crosses the line from no longer being missional and really getting into the work of the board, for lack of a better way to describe it. That's a good one.
Yeah, it is very good.
David, will you answer this last question? When the school pays 53% of the insurance and the vestry pays 43%, how is the money utilized when there's a hurricane and the school suffered most of the damage?
Yeah, and again, this has been such a big hurricane season that we talk about this a lot. So we recommend, frankly, that in the shared use agreement, we talk about deductibles and who is paying the deductible when there's a loss. A couple different ways to do that. Sometimes it's based on we just 50-50 the deductible regardless. Sometimes it's based on, well, where was the damage? Depending on where the damage was, we're going to do a pro rata split of the insurance, of the deductible based on that. So I'm assuming that since the question is being asked, there is no framework like I've described in the shared use agreement. So we have to just talk it out, and you can do it a couple of different ways. I think if you've got a 53-43 split, whatever the split
I think
is.
one of the questions is let's say there's damage to the property, you share the insurance policy proportionately. There's damage to the property, but say the school gets all the damage. Do they get all of the insurance money, or do they only get 53% of the insurance money?
Oh, I'm sorry. So we're not
or
talking about
vice
the deductible.
versa.
We're talking about,
Let's say the church,
the proceeds.
right? The
Yeah.
proceeds.
Well, I think part of that's going to be handled in the adjusting process, isn't it? Because part of that's going to be handled by, the loss, the amount of the loss, and how the loss needs to be allocated. Frankly, is going to be the insurance company handling that process. So obviously, if the school gym was wiped out, obviously the proceeds that are going to be received, whether it's going to the church or the parish, wherever the check goes, should be allocated to address the loss. So I think that question is going to be handled in the adjustment process. I'd be nervous if if it was adjusted, we get the detailed adjustment about how the proceeds are supposed to be used, and then there's some, well, let's do this instead, or let's do that instead. That would make me very nervous.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that would be good faith.
Yeah.
Well, thank you all. I know it is about 7 minutes after 4. David and MK, I leave the closing out to you. To finish us out, unless I'm mistaken and we have more than an hour.
No, that's it. And we thank you so much. It's been, Anne, you did a great job, and it's just such a fun, it's fun for us to do this together because we have lots to say about this relationship, right, David?
There's a lot to talk about. And the only thing I'll end is realize that, like board training, this kind of work is not something that you check off once and for all.
It's ongoing.
Like all relationships, it's ongoing. Like board training, it's ongoing. So luckily we've recorded this, so please make use of this if you want to share this with other members of the community as well. But always make that relationship front and center, and spend the time to make sure it's healthy.
And I would also say, please know that if you're a member of SAES, David and MK are there for you for your individual questions or concerns or troubleshooting. The same for those of you who are NAES members. If we can be of any assistance, just pop an email, give us a ring, and we'll be happy to have a follow-up conversation.
That's right. Thanks,
guys.